Yeah. It's Angelo's Film Review channel back again with 1 million reviews going to the movies. Now, this time, Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, and Tetris. The common theme between these two movies are both based on board games. First things first, I'll review the movie that I saw first. This movie, it was called Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves. It's part of a franchise. The franchise is not just movies, it's also board games, Vidya, PlayStation 2, TCG, notepads. Spoiler-free review. Wow. I love this movie. It's one of my favorites. I'm not like a Dungeons and Dragons fan. I've never actually played the game. I've known people that played it. I've talked to them for periods of hours in total over the course of my life about the game. So I have like a basic understanding of what it is. Some kind of board game. It's something that you do with friends. And that idea has always appealed to me as someone that has never had friends. But I've never been like so into it that I thought about committing to getting friends. I can watch movies and experience what it's like to be around people. And this movie, Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, it gave me a pretty good idea, apparently, of what it's like to have friends, sit in a room, and play this fantasy board game, Dungeons and Dragons. Based on what I'm seeing on the internet, the reactions from people, it seems like this movie's striking a chord with Dungeons and Dragons fans. It's also striking a chord with me because I really enjoyed it. I like fantasy movies. I never saw the original Dungeons and Dragons with one of the Wayans brothers, Marlon Wayans maybe, Jeremy Irons. I'm not like opposed to watching it, but I never have seen it. So this is like my first real deep dive into the Dungeons and Dragons franchise, and boy howdy, it's really super sweet. From the outside looking in, I was assuming it was going to be like an MCU kind of movie. They're going to do like the MCU formula on Dungeons and Dragons to revitalize the property and make it once again worthy of the big screen. And that really does seem like kind of what they were doing here. Points of reference, this is a lot like an MCU movie. It's also a lot like Pirates of the Caribbean, the good ones, the original trilogy. In terms of those kind of movies, this is a good one. This is a good escapist blockbuster. Comparing it to an MCU movie or something like that, there are a number of things that make it stand out. It's got practical effects, lots of them, incorporated flawlessly into some pretty impressive CGI. It doesn't feel like there are too many cooks in the kitchen. I think there's like 3 writers, 2 directors, but it feels like a pretty cohesive vision. Doesn't feel overwritten. Like an MCU movie, it's going for that mixture of humor, heart, and spectacle. It strikes a chord because it feels like there's a steady guiding hand to the character motivations. Even at times when the motivations could potentially feel contrived, they don't, because of just like one line that makes the whole thing make sense from a character perspective. The last thing that makes this really stand out, there's just no sequel baiting. This is a standalone movie, a completely standalone movie. I waited through the credits to see if there was like a stinger for like a sequel. There wasn't. There's a post-credit scene. It's just a silly joke. This is a real movie, a real fantasy blockbuster that I think everyone's gonna love, whether you're a Dungeons and Dragons fan or not. Spoiler review. This movie has a pretty crazy opening. For the first couple of minutes, I wasn't so sure how much I was relating to what was on the screen. I was a little hesitant to give myself over to what I was seeing. But by the time this opening was over, and it's a pretty long opening, a pretty epic, like 10-minute long opening, I was sold. And I can't say that the movie completely matches the energy of the opening over the whole course. It gets a little tiny bit more predictable after the opening, but still, pretty exciting. The opening is like you're introduced to our crazy characters. They're rogues. You're introduced to the fact that there's some crazy practical effects. You're introduced to the unexpected humorous twist. You're introduced to the fact that like nothing is as it appears to be. Anything could happen. This is a pretty chaotic environment. And it's all told through the framing device of our main characters in prison trying to appeal for a pardon. They tell their whole story while they're appealing. That gives us all the exposition we need going into the movie. Lots of crazy stuff going on in this universe. They're granted the pardon, but before our characters find out that they've been granted the pardon, they escape successfully. Very silly. This opening sequence also shows us some of the practical creatures that the film has to offer. Humanoid animal hybrids, and they're just like children's TV show looking costumes, sometimes with a little bit of CGI touch-ups. They look awesome. Like, if this was a children's TV show, wow, it would have a really high budget, because these are some awesome looking costumes. But you don't usually see costumes like this in a blockbuster movie, and it works really well, because it really feels like they're there, and it also feels just kind of demented and silly, and it really works with the tone. Then the movie proper starts. It's a little bit more formulaic of a fantasy than you might be led to believe if you're completely won over by this opening sequence. But it's still pretty good. Hugh Grant is introduced as a side character in the opening sequence, and I was hoping that he was just going to remain a side character, but of course it's Hugh Grant, so he can't just be a side character. Turns out he's the twist villain. And it's not much of a twist because it's revealed like a half hour in. But he does work as a villain, and he's plenty humorous. He's doing his Paddington 2 shtick, which we just saw him do in Operation Fortune Ruse de Guerre. He's doing that same thing here. And I think it works a little bit better here than it did in Operation Fortune. Works in both movies. I don't think Hugh Grant has worn out this new shtick he's got going on in his old age. He's not the only villain. There's also a sorceress that he's teamed up with. This sorceress is one of the weaker links of the movie. She feels a little bit like the character from Suicide Squad, that villainous sorceress character. But still, she's not that weak of a link. This movie doesn't have any really huge weak links. She still has a lot to offer, and she's still not really a bad villain. She has some nice scenes. She's the real intimidating, threatening one because she's so magical, and she has all these crazy powers. So our heroes, Chris Pine, Michelle Rodriguez, Justice Smith are the main core heroes. They have to fight Hugh Grant and the sorceress to save the land and to get a magic tablet that will bring back Chris Pine's dead wife. He also has a daughter. Hugh Grant and the sorceress have used their mind powers on the daughter to steal her away, while Chris Pine and Michelle Rodriguez were locked away in prison. So this is the central conflict. Chris Pine is fine. He's a good hero. Michelle Rodriguez and Justice Smith are great. Fantastic. Michelle Rodriguez is always great. Justice Smith, I've never seen him in anything that I liked him in. I hated him in Detective Pikachu. That's the main thing that comes to mind when I think of things that I've seen him in. But he's really great here. He's hilarious. Every time I see he has this look on his face, just like this horrible, like disgusted, sad, spiteful look on his face. Like he just wants to implode. And I wasn't expecting the comedy in this movie to like hit me so hard, but I really thought it was like funny all the way through. And not just funny, but like the emotional arcs works for me pretty well. Chris Pine has an emotional arc, and Justice Smith has an emotional arc. He's not just funny. He has to learn to become a better wizard, and it's like, I don't know, kind of sweet and deep. Chris Pine has to learn that he already has everything he needs in his daughter and in his friend Michelle Rodriguez. He doesn't need to bring back his dead wife. The friends we met along the way. And then another member of the group is like this little elf girl. She's another weak link, kind of. She's not really a well-developed character. She doesn't have much of an arc. She's just kind of like a sparky, quick-witted, dry little elf girl that's always making fun of things. Ironically, the sorceress and the elf girl, the film's two biggest, weakest links, have like a really incredible scene together early on in the movie where the elf girl uses her, like, she can change into animals, and she uses this to sneak into the castle or whatever to spy on the sorceress. And the sorceress just like immediately knows with her magic that the little elf girl is there, and she just like screams. She's like, "Ee!" It's like a jump scare. It's like a surprise. You don't expect this to happen, and it turns into this crazy chase where the elf girl is turning into all sorts of different animals and just like barely escaping the clutches of death. That might not sound like the most exciting thing in the world. It might not sound that original or unique, but in the film, just the execution and the whole thing is just like, it's truly affecting. Like, I was gripped during this scene, and I was gripped during much of the movie. Another example of how this movie can turn something that is pretty tropey into something that's like fresh and exciting is there's a scene where our characters use magic to interrogate corpses to find out information about a lost item, which is something we've seen in plenty of movies. Hellboy is something that was in. But this movie adds multiple twists onto this tropey situation. The characters don't ask the right questions, so they keep having to dig up new bodies. Then when they finally do ask the right questions, they realize that there's no one dead body that has the entire story, so they have to keep digging up different ones to piece together all the information that they need to find the item. And then there's also like a gag where when they resurrect the dead bodies, they have to ask them 5 questions before the dead bodies go back to being dead. So sometimes they don't need to ask the corpses all 5 questions, and then they're just like coming up with bullshit questions to ask the corpses so they can rest peacefully again. A groan-worthy premise, executed in a way where there's just like so many things keeping you on your toes. And that's really the best thing about this movie is it just feels like it's full of surprises. I don't know the Dungeons and Dragons lore, but it feels like this movie is utilizing so many different things from the game, and it's just got this deep world, and it's always got something that you wouldn't expect around the corner. Even if the package as a whole is slightly formulaic. And the score, I really love the score. The elf girl turns into this creature called an owlbear, and every time she turns into this creature, there's this like haunting musical score. As a Transcendent licensed adaptation, I've already brought up the MCU movies and the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. There are other movies that this reminds of. I feel like this is better than the recent Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, but these movies do have a lot in common. 2 swashbuckling adventures. I think this is a better one, a very similar one, and a better one. And not just for the fact that it doesn't do any sequel baiting. Puss in Boots was a movie that I didn't feel worked on an emotional level whatsoever. And contrastingly, this is a movie that I feel succeeds at everything it attempts, emotion-wise, and humor-wise, and style-wise. It also brings to mind movies like the Lego Movie, or Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Really commercial movies that just feel transcendent. As far as MCU movies, I like a lot of the MCU movies. This would definitely be an upper tier one if it was part of the MCU. This is co-helmed by one of the geeks from Freaks and Geeks. One of the writers and directors is John Francis Daley. I don't think I've seen any movie he's directed before. I know he co-directed, I think, the Vacation remake with this same partner. I think he might have worked on the script of one of the newer Spider-Man movies. I saw this movie, I think, last Sunday. So a week ago today, it's Sunday now, I saw it last Sunday. I just liked it more and more every morning when I woke up and thought about it. This is a really great movie. I'm going to go see it again when it comes out in theaters proper. I'm going to go see it in the 3D. Alright, the next movie that I'll be talking about is another licensed movie, Tetris. Spoiler-free review. So this is a sort of comedic espionage thriller based on the story of how Tetris came to be a worldwide phenomenon after its origins in communist Russia. I'm coming to you through YouTube. If you're a person who uses YouTube a lot, you may already be familiar with the story of Tetris. There are some popular retro gaming YouTube videos going over this story. I think I've seen 1 or 2 of them, just putting them on when I'm going to bed. Maybe the one by like the Gaming Historian, is that one? I think that's probably the one I've seen. And I would put it on to go to bed, so I've heard the story maybe a couple of times, but I've never heard it all the way through. So this was like half a new story to me. And so I also can't say like how accurate this movie was in depicting the story. This movie was produced by Matthew Vaughn, the director of the Kingsman movies, director of Kick-Ass, director of Stardust, director of Layer Cake, Guy Ritchie producer extraordinaire, the guy who brought us Guy Ritchie. If you were to just tell me that Matthew Vaughn produced a comedic espionage thriller based on the story of Tetris, then I could pretty much just make this film in my head. This is like an Apple TV original, so like it really has that kind of streaming quality. It really feels like you just get exactly what's on the tin, for better and for worse. It is enjoyable, exciting. There are some poppy elements that you'd expect with a Matthew Vaughn production. It's scored to like foreign pop covers, some like Russian pop covers some Japanese pop covers. Got a couple of covers of Holding Out for a Hero. That's all well and good, but it's also got like these kind of like ill-advised, personally for me, I found them abhorrent, like pixel art aesthetics, like transitions, where instead of like showing like an establishing shot of a building, it'll show like pixel art of a building, and it feels really cheap. It feels like they did this so they didn't have to go location scouting. It doesn't look like Tetris, it looks like Scott Pilgrim the game. It's not a bad movie, it's just got some unfortunate pixel art aesthetics shoehorned in, and a slightly cheap feel that fits in with the Apple TV vibes. I'm sure there are going to be people that this movie appeals to more than me, personally. Giant Tetris fans, people who are more familiar with the story. Unless being more familiar with the story makes this movie worse, which I can't say. I'll have to go look at some reactions on the Reddit. For me, this was middling, but like an appreciable waste of time. Not bad. Spoiler review. So this movie really goes hard on those espionage elements. It really wants you to feel that there's a sense of danger to the Tetris story. Seems like this movie wants to take itself a little more seriously than the content allows. It feels a little contrived at times. It feels like it's on autopilot as far as manufacturing the tension. There's very much a television quality to the way that the story is brought to the screen. That said, there's also some cinematic things about it, like the aforementioned soundtrack, or like a nice car chase that happens towards the end. There is a nice car chase that feels pretty real. But then this car chase has those pixel art aesthetics shoehorned into it. There's parts where there's a pileup of cars, and then all of a sudden the cars turn into pixel art. And I'm like, I swear they must have actually filmed the pileup. Why are you wasting your pileup that you filmed by painting over it with this ugly, cheap garbage? So that's kind of how the whole movie is. Pros and cons together in a perfunctory product. This movie definitely wants to consider itself a transcendent adaptation of a licensed property, but it doesn't really have the verve. It doesn't have the verve. It has the concept, and it has the intention, and it has the technical ability to bring this to the screen, but not to make it more than the sum of its parts. And maybe if this movie was released like 10 years ago or something, it would be more fresh. But we're getting to the point where post the Lego movie, and now we got Greta Gerwig's Barbie coming up, it's like, I don't get the ironic appeal of these licensed adaptations. I don't want licensed adaptations that break the mold in a meta way. I want licensed adaptations that know exactly what they're doing and like beam it out of their heart, like Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. Definitely, I'd say if you are interested in seeing this movie, I wouldn't go out of my way to see it in theaters. But I also wouldn't buy Apple TV to watch it. I don't know what the hell Apple TV is. Is that some kind of thing you pay for on the streaming? Unless that's like 99 cents a year, I don't think it's going to be worth it.